Great.
record. That should say recording your end. And can I just, is it a stager? Is that how I pronounce it?
Stager,
Stager. I
RG.
thought so. I just wanted to double check. Professor Gary Stager, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's great to be with you.
Where are you phoning in from?
I'm in a suburb of Los Angeles called Torrance, California.
Lovely. And what's the weather like today? Typical question.
About 70, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So I don't know, what's that about?
It's nice.
15 degrees. Yeah, it's nice. Short sleeve weather. Just finished playing tennis.
Fantastic. And Gary, quite possibly the most important conversation for our discussion. What's your coffee order for when I can finally nip over the Atlantic and buy your coffee?
I drink black iced tea.
Something
that's impossible to get in your part of the world.
Right. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that a recent drink of choice, or is that something which you've been consuming for a while?
No, I've drunk iced tea for a very long time. I used to drink sort of bottled stuff loaded with sugar, and as is available in Australia. But since I've gotten a little healthier and worried about calories, I just drink it black, and I make liters of it at a time and drink way too much of it.
Fantastic. And is there a book that you have read recently? It could be within your sphere of expertise and education, or it could be much more broadly, that has caused you to stop and reconsider a few things in your life.
I'm actually reviewing a lot of books that I've read in the past because I'm thinking about starting a progressive educator book club. So I'm trying to decide on, given the thousands of books that I own and millions that I haven't read, which books would I share with educators who I wanted to reacquaint with some powerful ideas. So I've been reading a lot of Frank Smith and Herb Cole, and there's a professor from Columbia who I just purchased a book by named Bettina Love. Has written a new book called Punished for Dreaming about race and education in our system here. And also I just reread Roger Shank's book, The Cognitive Computer, which was a book for lay people about artificial intelligence, published in 1984, and reread Chapter 7 of Seymour Papert's seminal book, Mindstorms, Children, Computers, and Powerful Ideas, because Chapter 7 is called Logo, Roots, AI, and Piaget. Because as you probably are aware, apparently education was revolutionized over Christmas holidays, and everyone's gone AI crazy. And for the folks who are interested in a more humane, sensible notion of children and learning and education and artificial intelligence, it would behoove them to read the vision set forth in 1980 by Seymour Papert in Mindstorms. And the fact that so few people are talking about that is proof that no one read up to Chapter 7.
Right. That's interesting. Do you think that should be essential reading for educators?
Yes, but I differ from some of my colleagues who also worked with Seymour Papert or admirers of his work. That was his first major book. I really recommend the second one, which is The Children's Machine. That colleagues referred to that as the book in which he discovers teachers. I think it's a little more accessible. The examples are more practical. Papert published 3 books for the mass readership: Mindstorms, The Children's Machine, and The Connected Family. And they all are kind of a fractal of each other. They all deal with essentially the same powerful ideas, but for different audiences. Mindstorms was intended for academics, and in later versions of Mindstorms, Papert actually wrote in the foreword about how had he realized that other people were going to read it, he wouldn't have been so arrogant. The examples wouldn't have been so as obtuse. The Children's Machine is the one that's about teaching and learning. and the connected family is about learning at home and families learning together. But like I said, the same ideas are sort of in all three,
Yeah.
just from a different point of view for a different audience. So I recommend to educators that they really should pay some attention to the children's machine.
Yeah. Fantastic. I'll put the links to all the resources that you talk about in the show notes so people can access that. One of the things I truly love about doing this podcast is that my shopping cart continues to be filled with books that I should have read. And so there's a constant stream of new books coming into our household. So I appreciate that. You've probably just cost me a couple of $100 there, but I appreciate it. And Gary, I was just wondering if you could have a dinner party with anybody. Obviously, your family isn't included in the head count. Who would you love to be there? Who would you like to sit down and have a meal with, either people who are currently with us or people that have passed?
Huh. I've been really fortunate in that I've been able to work with most of my education heroes and get to know a lot of them quite well, and as well as my musical heroes. I'm quite an admirer and aficionado of jazz, and I've gotten to know a lot of the great jazz musicians in my lifetime. Um, I think my colleague and friend Seymour Papert would be at the dinner table. Um, the great author and educator and civil rights leader Jonathan Kozol, who's a friend of mine who I haven't seen. I mentioned Herb Cole before. Um, I never got to have a conversation with Frank Smith, although he would be interesting. I Everything I know about teaching teachers, I learned from Dan and Molly Watt, and my summer institute, Constructing Modern Knowledge, is based on the experiences that I had learning from them when I was a young educator. Um, there's an Australian educator named David Loader, who's was the principal of the first school in the world where every kid had a laptop. And
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
he's probably the most consequential school leader of the last half century. I
Wow.
just had the great joy of having lunch with him when I was in Melbourne recently. Um, so those are, and musician friends like the great saxophonist Jimmy Heath and Phil Woods, and the
Yeah.
singer and pianist Freddie Cole. People who had a great joy and um, love of what they did,
Love that.
and willingness to share what they love and knew, and their expertise with others who were interested in what they were so passionate about.
Yeah. It's really interesting, Gary, just how many times music comes up, musicians, and it's wonderful how many, like I said, how many guests that I speak to that talk about jazz music and how that has such an impact on them. Why has that been particularly meaningful for you, and what is it about jazz that is particularly interesting to you?
Well, I aspired to be a jazz musician until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me. And I was fortunate to attend a high school where I had, in year 12, 3 music classes a day and 2 music classes a day in the
Right.
3 years before that, and had 2 working jazz musicians as my instrumental music teachers. When I was 13 years old, the great trumpet player and composer and arranger, band leader Thad Jones played at my high school. The great Roy Haynes, who's pretty much half of American music, music history, played at my high school. And it was a way of being part of something bigger than myself. It
I love that.
it, it brings beauty and joy and purpose. Um, I'm gobsmacked by the arrogance of youth that was required to think that I could possibly ever be good at it. Now that I understand the remarkable complexity of what some of my friends are able to accomplish on their instruments.
Love that.
And so I never I'm kind of proud of the decision. I don't even remember the exact moment, but the decision that I made that the world didn't need any more bad musicians. And I spend a lot of my time and disposable income attending concerts,
Love that.
probably half dozen or more a month. I'm heading to New York in a few weeks, and I'll see 2 or 3 performances a night. And I feel sorry for people who have never had one note of Wayne Shorter soprano sax reduced them to tears.
Mm.
And a lot of my passion, which in education is viewed as defect, is rooted in the fact that I was fortunate enough to have some experiences around the age of 12 years old, where I fell in love with programming computers and composing music and playing music and being around musicians, that have brought so much joy and purpose and meaning and beauty to my life. And all of my days have been committed to assuring that future generations of kids have the same quality of experience.
I love that, Gary. And do you think there are some, what are some of the parallels, do you think, between computing and composing? Because on the surface, it would seem like that marriage would not work. But like I said, the amount of people that I've spoken to that are engaged with and championing technology, that also have a love for jazz music, that also have a love for art and dance and drama, is really quite spectacular. So why do you think those two work so well together?
Well, I knew from an early age that it felt the same in my head what was happening.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think there's the solving problems within constraints, the immediate feedback, the debugging, the different paths to a working solution.
Yeah.
But I think if we expand the lens a little bit, I think it's fundamental to democracy.
Interesting.
The reason why kids should program computers is because it gives them agency over an increasingly complex and technologically sophisticated world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at a time of rising authoritarianism and fake news and propaganda and threats to democracy, it makes sense for kids to understand systems and to be at the center of them. And playing music is the ultimate democratic act, because it's not just learning in a group, as my colleagues in Reggio Emilia point out. It's learning as a group.
Yeah.
It's supporting one another and making something beautiful that's negotiated with other humans in real time within constraints.
Yeah, I think that's so true. A number of years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of traveling to South America, to Chile. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a history of oppression around the arts for many, many years. And what was so wonderful was to go to a number of performances in Chile and just see this incredible resurgence of the arts, whether that be music or dance or drama. And it was really wonderful I hadn't appreciated until then just the incredible role that these things play in just building cohesive and critical and collaborative societies. And it's really wonderful to hear you talk about such passion.
Yeah, it's what makes us human. And when yeah, I've done a little bit of work in Latin America, and not only did I feel that way about music, and I think there's a great deal to learn from El Sistema, which is the Venezuelan youth orchestra movement,
Yes.
where from the second you express an interest, you're in an orchestra. And wow. Even if you have to count to 7 million and play one note, you're part of something larger than yourself.
Yes.
And they don't call them schools, they call them nucleos. And a colleague of mine, Tricia Tunstall, who wrote a fantastic book called Changing Lives, about El Sistema and the great conductor Gustavo Dudamel, who came out of that system and now conducts the LA Philharmonic. She talked about how these nucleos create an alternative universe, an alternative reality for the kids, where they're part of something. They're part of something beautiful. They're making something together. Their parents are proud of them, and when they have to get off work and dress nicer to come watch their children perform, there's a sense that there's a sense of hope and direction. And I find there's a similar approach in Latin America to education as well.
Wow.
That what teachers do is sacred. And I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. I was, um, I don't know, shanghaied into, if that's a might be a politically incorrect term at this point, but I was recruited, enticed to be part of a 2 week long workshop for teachers on an island off the coast of Maine with almost no internet access and nothing to do and limited food options. And Seymour Papert was ostensibly organizing it, although you would rarely use Seymour and organize in the same sentence. And there were a few dozen educators gathered in this meeting room when I arrived, and we went around the circle as one does, introducing ourselves. And there were about 50% of the educators from the United States. If I remember correctly, they're from a lot of them were from the state of Iowa, kind of in the Midwest, a rural state.
Yeah.
And the other half were from Costa Rica and Chile and Peru. And the Americans all introduced themselves by saying, "Hi, I'm Gary. My principal's a jerk. Hi, I'm Matthew. I don't have enough printer paper. Hi, I'm Mary.
Yeah.
My laptop won't charge."
Yeah.
And then they got to the Latin educators who said things like, "I'm here because this is a way of restoring democracy to my people."
Wow.
And it was like really, I mean, it was sort of Earth One and Earth Two. There was a very different way of viewing the world. And all of those countries have a tradition of radical educators as well. Well,
Yeah.
whether it's Paulo Freire, and every one of those countries in that part of the world has their radical educators that folks who are interested in the kind of work that I'm interested in are familiar with. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sorry, Gary, my little one just ran in the room as we.
That's okay.
I'll have to edit that out.
That's okay.
It's so interesting, isn't it, Gary? I mean, to hear that, I mean, I'm sure that would really put things into perspective. I mean, you've got teachers, as they do in Australia, complaining about what they don't have, but then other educators really talking about the cause and the ideals behind education and how it can really transform and change a generation. I think it's really wonderful. Gary, I just wanted to take you back to when you were at school. Was there a teacher that made a difference in your life, and did you ever get a chance to thank them?
So, schooling was a mixed bag for me. It was mostly terrible, for a lot of reasons. Not particularly unique to me, and yet there was almost always a teacher I could hang out with. And so from the very earliest days, I not only had adults who I could form a positive relationship with, but I also was acutely aware of how preposterous this system was.
Wow.
And then by the time I got to sort of what we would consider middle school or junior high and high school, there were teachers who I had quite strong relationships with, and many of them I'm still in touch with today.
Yeah.
And I have thanked them in person and in writing and in other forms. Yeah.
And what do you think, Gary, were some of those qualities of those great teachers? Because, and I'll just take you on a little sort of a sidetrack for a moment. I had this one teacher who I had the privilege of interviewing a number of episodes ago, called Mrs. Taylor-Jones, and she was my year 3 teacher, and I have absolutely no idea what she taught me. I'm sure there would be something in there about fractions and maths and English, but what I do remember is how I felt when I went into her classroom. And I was wondering if that was a sort of a similar vein that you felt when you think about some of these great teachers in your life. Do you remember the content, or do you remember the feeling that you had when they interacted with you?
Oh no, I don't remember any content at all. But
Not at all.
But no one does. That no one does, and that shouldn't come as any surprise to you. I mean, my colleague Brian Harvey says if you want to reform schools, the first thing you do is throw out half the curriculum, any half. We have a morbidly obese curriculum that we just keep adding to, and it's creating all kinds of problems for teachers and kids, and none of it actually matters. That said, I have a lot of kind of negative memories of primary school first. So I'll start there. I mean, I never tell these stories, but um, in second grade, I remember my teacher tied me to my chair with a jump rope, with a skipping rope. And I remember making her cry over the Arbor Day poems that I led an insurrection and refused to read. Um, and I
Oh,
also, I also thought I invented forgery when I forged my mother's signature, like in crayon on a letter once about me being in trouble. I was really proud of myself. I thought I had invented that idea. Um, so that was sort of second grade. In third grade, we had a young teacher who had like weekly dance parties, and I liked that. And it didn't even matter that there was a teletype connected to a mainframe timeshare system in the next classroom, because although I would have probably liked to use the computer, dance parties was good. Um, but by junior high, so that's sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, I had a couple interesting teachers. One was my high school band, my middle school band director, Dick Lucas, who for some reason ran an after school tennis program, and I played tennis for the first time with him.
wow. Wow.
Um, and we played music that was always too hard for us, and we knew it was too hard for us, but we knew it was kind of special. They were playing music that was too hard for us. And he passed away a number of years ago, but he ended up becoming a student of mine. I stayed in touch with him until he died, and he came to workshops of mine and such later on. I had Mr. Jones, who taught me how to program computers in year seven and made me feel smart for the first time in my life. Um, and then there were two social studies teachers,
Wow.
history, if you will. Um, and they're interesting given the current climate. One I never talk about, but I'm in touch with fairly regularly. And a guy named Mr. Miller. And Mr. Miller was kind of a wild and crazy, one might have accused him of being a hippie back then, history teacher. And given the current political climate in which teachers are being accused of indoctrination and books are being banned and burned and teachers are being fired in the United States for reading the Diary of Anne Frank, um, Hack Miller actually had his politics on the classroom bulletin board.
Wow.
I mean, he wasn't neutral. He was a human who had political views and he shared them with us. And I don't think anyone was damaged by this. I think we were engaged by it. And if we wanted to argue with him about it, I'm sure that was possible. There was another social studies teacher, though, who I think about a lot because he was the whole package, a guy named Bob Prail. I had him for seventh grade social studies, and Mr. Prail was the kind of teacher that anyone who had him had their life irrevocably improved by the experience.
Wow.
It is also the case that the system hated Mr. Prail and tried everything in its power to make him miserable every day of his career.
Wow.
So they did it in ways big and small, subtle things like every time the bell rang, Mr. Prail had to gather all his belongings and move to another classroom. Because although most teachers had a classroom assigned to them, Mr. Prail liked children too much and the children liked him too much. And the system's reaction to that was, let's make him move every 43 minutes. And we made a film. We read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we had to buy ourselves, and we made a film of it. And another class read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and they made a film. Back in the days when it was hard to make a film, he got accused of teaching Eastern religions because he was teaching us how to relax or meditate or deep breathe or something, which seemed perfectly appropriate for seventh graders. He never went anywhere near the textbook. And near the end of his career, he had at first told me that, I said, how long are you going to do this, Prail? And he said, oh man, I'm healthy. I could do this another 20 years. And then about a year later, he said, hey, Stager, I'm quitting. I said, why? He says, because I'd like to be able to swim. No, I'm sorry. I'd like to be able to ski or ride my bike once in a while. And I thought, how broken is a system that's so inflexible that you lose a master teacher like that because you can't figure out a way to let them work
Yeah.
a few less hours. And to surprise him before he retired, I flew cross country and walked into his classroom. And the kids were working on these elaborate projects where they were designing cartoon characters that were in historical fiction that they were writing, and they were going to be reading those to the kids in the primary school down the street.
Love that.
And they were all deeply engaged in this, like I said, this elaborate project. I don't know all the details of it. And after he introduced me to the class, he said, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you while you're working on your project, but he said, I have a dilemma. And as soon as the kids heard Mr. Prale say, I have a problem, they perked up and they were hanging on his every word. And he said, you know, we're reading Elie Wiesel's book Night, and I'm thrilled that you all bought it with your own money, and I'm really proud of you and the maturity with which you're approaching the serious subject of the Holocaust, and the discussions we're having are really quite moving and riveting. But the chapter wants me to, I'm sorry, but the school district says I have to finish chapter 8 in the textbook by the end of the week. So I've thought really long and hard about this, and I've decided that I'm going to give you an enhanced study guide for the chapter. And one of the little innocent kids raised their hand and said, Mr. Prale, what's an enhanced study guide? And Prale said, well, if you remember in last chapter, I gave you a study guide which had all the questions that were going to be on the test. The enhanced study guide has all the questions and all the answers that are going to be on the test. And without even a giggle, the kid said, okay, and they went back to working on their projects.
Wow.
And I can't help but think that a year, 2 years, 10 years, 50 years from now, one of those kids is going to be in a pickle and think to themselves, I had a teacher who put my needs ahead of some arbitrary list of bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, I know the podcast is called The Art of Teaching. I think, you know, it's part of the art of teaching, of letting the kids in on the cosmic joke that is teaching sometimes.
Yeah.
And letting them know that you prioritize them in learning something meaningful and creating a productive context for learning rather than just covering some arbitrary curricular topic.
I mean, Gary, that takes bravery, doesn't it? Because I'm sure that, and then also I think it takes a respectful, not even a respectful, it takes a disrespect for the rules and an understanding that as the educator, we need to be the ones that are making the right decisions for the kids that we teach. And would you say that you have held on to that rebellious streak throughout your career, or how has that served you that time in that wonderful teacher's class?
Yeah, I think teaching is a moral calling. I think, you know, the answers to most questions plaguing education are theological in nature. They're either right or wrong.
Yeah.
And if I have any superpower, there's a whole lot of things that I don't care about at all, that never enter my mind, that a lot of other educators are terribly concerned with.
Yeah. Would you mind elaborating on what some of those are?
Sure. Classroom management. I never walk into a classroom worrying about classroom management because I never enter a classroom thinking I need to manage anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I put myself in deliberately complicated, complex, difficult situations regularly. When I was in Melbourne a few weeks ago, I ran a family math and art night involving computer programming at my favorite primary school, and 55 P to 6 kids and their parents, so it was over 100 people, showed up on a Tuesday night on a school night at 6:30 p.m.
Wow.
for a couple of hours of computation and art and mathematics. And I love walking into crazy situations like that where I have to very quickly evaluate what's important here. What's the least that I can do so that they can do the most? How do I share the two powerful ideas that I want the parents to leave with so that they understand have a context for understanding what I'm about to do with their kids, and hold the kids' interest long enough to be able to show them how to do something that will occupy them for 2 hours. I've worked in settings with 300 kids that I've never met before. I've convinced the state of Victoria to let me teach in the 2 worst schools. You pick them, I don't care. I want a half a day every day with the same multi-age heterogeneous group of kids in schools that you've deemed a failure. My own doctoral research was based on creating a high-tech, multi-age, project-based alternative learning environment inside a prison for teenagers where our kids were 13 to 21 and had a laundry list of of alleged learning disabilities and pathologies applied to them. So I never, and in that context, in a prison where Amnesty International was accusing the state of torturing children, and where we were supposed to be working with the worst kids in society, when we were able to put their needs and interests and talents and curiosity and passion ahead of some arbitrary list of stuff, we had a scenario in which in 3.5 years, not a single kid had to be removed from the classroom for discipline reasons.
Wow.
So this isn't just a theory of mine or a dream. It's my lived experience. So when people are trying to figure out ways to use AI to grade children, or use technology to do less grading, or to be more efficient at grading, or they're concerned with, should we be doing formative assessment or summative assessment? What if you did none? Maybe just if that seems too outrageous, maybe just use that as a thought experiment.
Yeah.
But all assessment interrupts the learning process. Even if I just said, "Hey Matthew, what you doing? I just made you stop doing it." Now it's up to reasonable adults to determine what level of interruption is acceptable. But why do we all just nod our heads and say, "Oh, of course we need to be doing this, and we need to be doing more of it and get better at it"?
Yeah.
What if we just shifted our focus to knowing the kids? And one of the reasons why Mr. Prale was such a solid history teacher was because he knew history as well. So I'm not diminishing the role of discipline knowledge or domain knowledge, but I think part of the art of teaching is knowing what you're supposed to be teaching and knowing the kids, and finding a way to create a productive context for learning where those two things intersect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Gary. And it reminds me that our job of educators is really not about content. It's really not about curriculum. It's about creating those spaces. Our primary job is to create those spaces in which young people can thrive, and young people can engage in challenging ideas and to push themselves. It's almost as if the content is secondary. Would you agree somewhat?
Yeah, but I'm always focused on what can they do.
Yeah.
I think schools have an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love.
I love that.
And to create a context in which they can become good at something.
Yeah.
And so, I delight in the company of nutty kids. I have no interest in catching anyone doing anything. Sometimes I think, I'm really sorry you weren't able to get that job as a prison guard that you so had your heart set on, and you had to become a teacher. But I just don't understand why so many people find themselves in oppositional roles to their students.
Yeah.
I am much happier and much more effective as an educator when I view the children collegially, in a collegial fashion.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's in ways big and small. When I was working in the prison, if I was driving by a donut shop on the way to an office job, every couple weeks I might stop in and buy donuts and share them with my coworkers.
Love that.
Why wouldn't I do that with my students?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were moments where some of this may have been, teenage melodrama, but these severely deprived kids would write them would not only thank you, but they would save the donut for the kid who wasn't there at that moment, and make sure there was one left. And they would sometimes write you a thank you letter. And there were times where a kid would come to class all agitated and hungry, and something bad had happened, and I turned to one of my colleagues and said, "Go get this kid something to eat." And I remember in this one instance, this girl wrote a thank you letter in which she said, thank you for getting me that sandwich. It saved my life. And you never know when that's hyperbole or true. And it's not that hard to be nice to kids.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And Gary, did you, looking back to when you were at school, did you have any idea that you'd be a professor at a university? Does that make sense looking back, or is this where you thought you would be when you left school?
Well, I'm not currently. So
Yeah.
truth, truth and full disclosure. It's funny. I should, at the dinner conversation, that you asked about, hypothetical. I should have my father sit at the table because I need to ask him some questions. There was never any question I was going to go to university, even though I was a terrible student,
Yeah.
because we have a fairly forgiving system in the United States where there's pretty much a place for anyone who wants to go. Now, granted, there's financial burdens associated with it and obstacles and such, but there was never any question I was going to go to college. Um, but I don't remember ever talking to my parents about what I was going to study or what I was going to become. It was always left up to me. And I got a scholarship initially to go to Berklee College of Music. And like I said, I pursued that for a while. And then I decided to leave there. I changed schools a few more times. And when I decided I didn't have what it took to become a professional jazz musician, I switched my studies to elementary education. And I've taught everything from preschool through doctoral level. So it was just no, I had no idea what I was going to do. I still have no idea what I'm going to do.
Do you know what, Gary? It's really, it's actually really refreshing to hear that, because the amount of people that I've had the privilege of interviewing and hold in really high esteem, such as yourself, it's very easy to put these people on pedestals and think they've always known what they wanted to do. And there's me, us mere mortals going, oh my gosh, like, I don't really have a clear path here. But it's so wonderful to hear people like yourself saying that you can actually just pursue your interest and your passion and it be a positive thing and work out somehow in the long run. I think it's really reassuring to hear that.
No, it's yeah. I mean, one of the other things that I really believe is that education isn't vocational in nature,
Yeah.
and and of my three adult university educated children, the only one who has lived on her own with health insurance, a steady paycheck, and her own apartment since the second she graduated was the art major.
Wow, interesting.
And she currently earns a living crocheting.
Isn't that interesting?
Which is something she actually is some title like chief learning designer, or she's in charge of video production for a company called the Woobles that makes all in one little package incredibly adorable crochet kits with video instructions step by step on how to execute the pattern. And she can edit video, and she can cut code, and she can speak, and she can write. She has an incredibly strong liberal arts education. She worked in the nonprofit sector for a while. She went back to graduate school at the Art Institute of Chicago and got a master's degree in textiles. But this, her essay to get into university in the United States was about starting the crocheting and knitting club at her high school, and how she had to overcome the remarkable bureaucratic hurdles, which as a parent, I wasn't even aware of until I read the essay. Getting permission and finding a sponsor and a room and a time. And then after she had taught the members of the club how to crochet, she wanted to introduce knitting and was told that they couldn't knit because you couldn't have knitting needles at school because they could be used as a weapon. And waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning in a cold sweat, worrying about her lesson plan for knitting a crocheting club the next day, because how am I going to knit without knitting needles? And then having the epiphany that if I go to the supermarket and sweet talk them at the takeaway counter into letting me take all of the chopsticks, I can bring those into school and put them into pencil sharpener and sharpen them and make them into knitting needles. And then we could knit with chopsticks and we'll solve all the problems. And that essay and her being a good kid got her into 7 of the best liberal arts universities in America, where she earned a fantastic education. She ended up going to a place called Bard College and got a fantastic education. But there's a million of these stories of people who are successful at what they do by finding something that they're good at, that someone will pay them to do, that they can hopefully become great at.
I love that. I think that's really inspiring, and what an incredible story of entrepreneurship. coming up to
Well,
obstacles.
I should tell you the one. Yeah, and the other piece of that story, which is this is the only part that I can take any credit for. About a year ago, this company that she now works for called the Woobles was on Shark Tank in the United States, and
Wow,
I called.
I thought it sounded familiar.
Yeah,
I'm a big fan of
it's
Shark
on the
Tank.
front page of Yeah, it's on the front page of Amazon, and I called Yvonne and I said, "Make yourself a job here."
Wow, wow.
Now she works for them.
I love that. That's such a wonderful story, Gary. Like I said, of an ability of a really amazing individual to overcome challenges and not take the first no as an answer. I think that's really wonderful. Gary, I do want to be I want to be respectful of your time, and it's been such a fascinating conversation, just hearing some of the motivations behind some of your incredible work. And I just wanted to talk briefly about your recent work. So one that you co-authored, I think, with Cynthia Solomon, or sorry, my mistake, she wrote the forward for it. And it's 20 things to do with a computer, forward 50. And I just love, and full disclosure, I'm about halfway through the book, so I haven't finished the whole book. But for those people that haven't read it, what's the main thesis behind that book, and what did you hope to achieve with this project? Because it's a really gripping read for someone like myself that doesn't have a computer science background.
So let's go back to that dinner table conversation, that metaphor you used earlier. One of the greatest joys of my life is being able to introduce my heroes and sheroes to other educators. Nothing brings me greater joy than creating the opportunity for educators such as yourself to spend time in the company of greatness. And that's one of the motivational forces behind my Constructing Modern Knowledge Summer Institute, where we not only have great educators, but people who are wildly successful at careers that their school never told them existed, and who are technology pioneers.
Yeah.
In the case of 20 Things to Do with a Computer, in 1971, Seymour Papert and Cynthia Solomon wrote a paper called 20 Things to Do with a Computer that was quite extraordinary in that very few people had ever seen a computer at that point, let alone were thinking about children using computers, let alone we're talking about kids programming computers, having agency over them, making things with them, and connecting them to external devices and robotics and communicating and playing with linguistics and geometry. And their paper was a provocation that predicted one-to-one computing, personal computing, the maker movement, computer science for all. And it was rooted in Piaget and a strong progressive tradition, and came out of the early work of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. And there was a stunning statement in that paper that said, we've done most of these activities already with primary school children. Yeah. So when I encounter a school that's struggling to come up with a tech plan in 2023, I often hand them a copy of the 1971 document and say, see how you measure up to this. The motivation behind the book was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of that remarkable paper by asking some of the pioneers who were around contemporaneously during that time and who have done the work ever since, as well as feature some really creative educators and thought leaders who are working today, to recognize that we stand on the shoulders of giants. I often say that the key to improving education is to find a cure for amnesia. We keep discovering that which already exists each time with diminished expectations.
Yeah, wow.
And when a school principal says to me, if only we knew what to do, I like to suggest, swing by my house. I'll lend you one of the thousands of books behind me that all will tell you what to do. Like I said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We know what to do. And so it was important for me to honor my friends, Seymour and Cynthia, who wrote that 1971 paper. And in this tumultuous time, in this sort of idea-averse time, to remind people that educational technology attracted my interest in the early 80s because that's where the smartest, most radical, most social justice minded educators were.
Yeah.
And it's we should return to that as again. I mean, I joke that that book is going to be really big 100 years from now.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I'm spending a lot of my time archiving and sharing work that would otherwise would have disappeared. I run a website called the Daily Papert that's the largest archive of Seymour Papert's work, both written work as well as audio and video that I keep finding and pay to transcribe and to share. Yes. And I've been finding a lot of the seminal educational computing work because I think it's important for people to understand that we've solved these problems before, and now we have this wondrous technology that supercharges all the things we could have ever dreamed of, and we're wasting all this potential. I mentioned Jonathan Kozol earlier, and one of my favorite comments from him is you're only 7 once. And there needs to be some urgency to our work for those of us who are involved in teaching kids or teaching teachers to teach kids, that if we can't just keep saying next year or maybe later. We have these wondrous opportunities that exist now, not just to teach kids the things we've always wanted to know, maybe with greater efficiency or comprehension or stickiness, but there are chances to learn and do and know and share and love and create in ways that were unimaginable before.
I love that.
And again, I'm fascinated by this topic of the art of teaching because I think sadly that notion is missing from the rhetoric around school reform and innovation and improvement. That you almost never hear a discussion of the art of teaching. Teacher preparation has been reduced to compliance, phonics, lesson plan writing, maybe diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when I studied to be a primary school teacher, it was required by law to learn to play the piano a little bit and to teach science and maths and social studies and phys ed and take the kids outside and create projects and use manipulatives and read literature. And that required you to know your students and to blur the artificial boundaries between subject areas. And we're continuously eroding those opportunities from the experience of teachers and kids, that we're suffering from this spiral where we remove agency from teachers and then they become less thoughtful, more or more automatic, more mechanical in their processes. And then guess what? The results suffer. And then the system responds by removing more agency from them.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to make an Uncle Tom's Cabin film in 7th grade and read a book that wasn't on the official list of junk textbooks, because first of all, there's no time, but more importantly, it hasn't occurred to anyone to do that. And when your school, I'm horrified by primary schools that are like little TAFEs or universities now, where every 40 minutes kids move on to something else, and where teachers are specializing as if you're incapable of teaching reading and maths to a 7-year-old. That and you have to have a reading coach come in to help you teach a kid to read. There's all these intrusions and interruptions that ensure that projects are impossible, that connections between people and concepts and domains and skills are difficult to make, that kids never get to work on something long enough for them to become good at it or to fall in love with it. And then we have the audacity to pathologize them and accuse them of having deficit disorders or attention deficit disorders. So I think a lot about this notion of the art of teaching, and I think it's a lost art, and we need to redouble our efforts to ensure that it makes a comeback.
Yeah, absolutely, Gary, and I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, when I named the podcast, I really wanted to bring back some of that kind of wonder and excitement and innovation and just awe back into our profession. And my hope is that through conversations with people all around the world like yourself, that if we can invest something back into that discussion, I would be immensely proud. And I just have one final question for you, Gary. I mean, you've covered so many topics today. Almost each topic is worthy of a podcast episode itself. But
anytime.
Yeah, if I was sitting down with you, Gary, and I was just about to set foot in a classroom, I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I've got my teaching certificate ready to go, what would be a short piece of advice that you would give me so that I can be that teacher that truly makes a difference?
Less us, more them. Anytime you think you should intervene on behalf of some educational transaction, it's worth asking the question, is there less that I could do and more that they can do?
Yeah. I couldn't agree.
I was, I recently had, worked in a school in Melbourne where I was teaching computer programming and physical computing, microbit robotics. The first and second graders who I never met before, who had never seen anything like it. And, I mentioned something on social media about it, and people immediately wanted to see my lesson plans or know what resources I was using. And now I've got a lifetime's worth of experience and a bag of tricks that I can draw upon. But the thing that I loved about that experience, if I put my learner hat on, was what's the smallest seed I could plant that generates the most beautiful blossom, the largest garden?
I love that.
How do I have the discipline? How do I have the discipline to shut up? Something I haven't done here, but how do I have the discipline to give the kids a minute's worth of information, so that they can then spend hours or perhaps days or months or playing with some ideas?
Wow.
And then the art of teaching comes back to noticing when the energy level dips and intervening, or observing some kids break through and announcing it for others so they can learn from them, or answering a specific question with as little interruption as possible so that the kids don't lose their train of thought and continue working on what they're doing. But it was having the restraint to sort of trust the kids and to respect the culture of childhood, so that they could do the thing. And I got stuck into someone a couple of days ago. Oh no, Education Week had an article about more effective icebreakers for PD. How to have non-cringeworthy icebreakers. And I said, no, do the thing. Don't warm up to the thing or ice break to the thing. Don't talk about the thing. Do the thing.
Yeah.
We're constantly inventing levels of artifice that are unnecessary. So I even when you're people are talking about social emotional learning. If your school is investing in social emotional learning, the damage is already done. If we didn't make kids feel miserable, we wouldn't have to treat them for being miserable. My last piece of advice for that young bushy-tailed teacher would be, see what you can do to create an environment where the kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to class, to continue on working on something that matters to them, where school is the place where you gain benefit from being co-located in the same space at the same time.
Love that.
And where you wake up every morning and ask yourself, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life?
Fantastic. Gary, that is my mind is spinning, and your passion for teaching and teachers is contagious. And I thank you for I thank you for the decades and decades and decades of investment into our wonderful profession. And my hope is that there would be somebody driving to work over here in Sydney or over in London, and they would hear this interview, and it would inspire them to be that teacher that truly makes a difference. So I can't thank you enough, Gary, for taking the time to talk with me today. And I would love at some point to be able to do a round two, because like I said, we have covered
Absolutely.
so much in this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it.
No, thank you. And I'm happy to work with schools and show you what this looks like in practice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary.